Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So last month I uploaded one of my first videos on this channel showing the progress that I have made on my first attempt at making a wider scaled video game. Now since then there's been a lot that has happened, so why don't we just jump straight into it and talk about it. Okay, so after 1 month of progress, I was very excited to get this in the hands of other people and showcase everything that I've worked on since the days of it just being a simple game jam concept. So I held a very small playtest. I only had 2 different people play the game, a person that doesn't really have much experience with gaming and one that does. And I was gonna have more people, but just after having those 2 people play my game, I had already accumulated almost 3 pages of bugs that needed to be fixed. And so it was becoming very clear that I was gonna need a more organized manner of tracking these changes to my game. Alright, so I have been using Trello before and I've had great success with just using it to keep track of personal projects, stuff with my organization, stuff with my studies and things like that. So it was a natural first choice when it came to needing something to organize, files or things that I had to get done in a sort of to-do list type fashion for my game. And so I took the playtest feedback that I got and I divided it into different categories such as bugs, quality of life, ideas, etc. And this gave me some buckets that I could use to store things in. This also gave me a good idea of what I would need to work on next. So I used this process to create a nice workflow, and I called it the FIB process. And so that stands for fixing, improving, and building. So first I would focus on fixing bugs and things that aren't really working as I intend them to work. Then after that I can make some tweaks on the back end, mostly based on testing, and these would mostly be like quality of life changes, but I'll talk more about that later. And lastly, I would continue to build upon what I have already made and add some new ideas or elements to my game. So let's take a deeper dive into how I implemented this FIB process following my playtest. The number one thing that was recommended to me, and I only had 2 people, so it was mostly just both of them really advocating for this, was to implement any sort of tutorial functionality. I understand the need for it as my game doesn't really lend itself to being very easily playable, as you have to drag tiles onto a map to create a dungeon, and you have to make sure that the dungeon is completable before you can even go play it. So I definitely understand where they're coming from, and so this is where I started. I wanted to make sure that I would be able to add a tutorial, and so I got to work with it. So what did I do? I added a text box functionality to my game, and this was important because I needed to do this later on anyway, so it was a good time to add this. And the way it works is I basically can give it a sprite and text in a dictionary format or an array format, and it'll kind of spit out the text that it's given, and it'll have a little sprite that talks along to the dialogue. And I think this was a great way to implement it. So I gave it some tutorial dialogue that plays at the beginning of the game to kind of ease the player into what they're doing. It also slows it down for the player so that they don't get overwhelmed, as they're gonna have to read through that dialogue, and it's not a lot, but if there is more that is needed, then I can add some more. So some other bug fixes that I changed mostly involve stuff having to do with the room generation. This is my first time doing procedural generation, so obviously some things were not going to get done correctly, but it wasn't too bad. I mostly just had some bugs with sometimes rooms would generate with no doors, and sometimes multiple items would spawn out of one chest. And I also just wanted to, I had some problems with the way that tiles were dragged onto the map, so I also made sure to go through and fine-tune bugs happening there. Alright, now I can focus on improving. So there was a lot of great feedback that I received, as well as how to make things more clear, especially from the less experienced gamer. And because I want my game to be catered to as many people as possible for now, I wanted to make sure that these ideas were getting implemented, or at least getting my attention. So some of these changes had to deal with UI elements. For this game, I had taken a lot of inspiration from some of my favorite games, such as Zelda, Tunic, Vampire Survivors, Hades. However, combining all these elements, especially in the HUD design, kind of led to some very busy UI during gameplay that could get very overwhelming, like they were playing Final Fantasy XIV or something, and that's not the vibe that I'm going for. So we had to make some changes. I went ahead and I made sure to not have any UI occurring on the gameplay part of the screen, because I didn't want things to get in the way, and if they did get in the way of the actual gameplay, I wanted it to be for a very minimal amount of time. So with some of these changes, I was able to make it more of my own style and attempt to make it a little bit more sleeker by keeping all of the main UI elements along the border of the screen, which is where the walls are and all that. There were some other tweaks that I made to different things, like updating the player movement and the enemy movement and a couple more things, but I think it would probably be best to just show you. You've been watching gameplay from my old build, or I'm actually not sure what you've been watching, but here is the new build of what it looks like, and just look at that. Look at all these pretty colors and these new UI and all that. It looks great. But yeah, so that is how it looks now, and I think it looks a lot better. Alright, so now we get to my favorite part of the process, which is adding new features. And this is definitely the most exciting part for me as a math major, because I'm basically creating problems and then figuring out a way to solve them. So for example, if I want to add something like player upgrades, then now I have a problem of how do I go about implementing this. And so I can brainstorm how I want to go about it, and in this case this leads me to a solution where I create a button entity that can be upgradable, and it'll have access to a key whenever I create one of these buttons. And then whenever the button is clicked, it will use the key to access a dictionary with the player's upgrades and change the value associated with that key, which is stored globally. And so that's just one of the ways that I can go about, adding new features and solving the problems that I create for myself. So what other kinds of things that I add? Well, there is a lot. So I added some more items. In the original build, there was only 2 items, and that could get very old very quickly. So I went ahead and I quadrupled this number with 6 new items and 1 new consumable item that can be found in the dungeons. So these items, they range from like a wind effect that pushes enemies back. There's a deployable bomb. There's a ball that orbits you, and there's a couple more. But with these new items, I also made new chests. So I made 4 different kinds of chests. They're each like a different tier of rarity, and they have their own pools of items that they can pull from. And I added up some basic RNG, functionality that will, pick one of these chests and it'll put it into the dungeon. I might revisit the actual function for it later because it's a very basic function, but I'll kind of just see how it feels for now and then come back to it. Another big thing that I added was I added biomes, and I implemented it in a way that I was very satisfied with. So the way it works is very similar to PokeRogue, if you guys have ever played that. Basically, you have this map of different places that you can go, and every time you leave a biome, the arrows coming out of it, most of the time there's a lot of them, it'll pick one of those arrows and it'll follow it to the new biome. And all the biomes are just interconnected into so many different paths and circles and all that. And it's a very nice and sophisticated design to do biome shifts. And so I wanted to implement that, and I went ahead and I did that. Right now there's only 8, so it's definitely not as complicated as PokeRogue. I think they have like 30 in that game, so yeah, but I've got my different circles. I went ahead and I drew it out on my iPad, and I made sure to connect them all in that way. So there's 8 biomes, like I said, but one of them is being saved for the final area of the game. So there's technically only 7 that you can really play through right now. Another big change was the addition of room types. So before, you could see the amount of enemies and chests in a dungeon just by looking at a tile, but that didn't have the effect that I was after. I want players to have a sort of sense of strategy when they're building their dungeon. I wanted them to look at, this room tile and see, oh, this has a lot of chests and no enemies, I better use this tile. Or, oh, this room has a ton of enemies, I don't want to deal with that, so I'm not going to use that tile. But after the initial playtest, it didn't really seem like players felt like it meant anything to them. They would just put the tile that made the most sense for connecting the rooms and not really thinking about what kind of room it was. So in order to alleviate that, or to change it up a little bit, I made room types. And right now there's only two. There's chest rooms and there's enemy rooms. And they're kind of self-explanatory, but chest rooms are a guaranteed safe area with a chest for the player. And an enemy room is actually more like a swarm room that have lots of enemies that must be killed before you can leave the room. So I'm hoping that this change will kind of garner the effect that I'm after, and I'm looking forward to seeing how players interact with that. A couple more things that I added a main menu and a name for my game. I might change the name later, but for right now I'm happy with the very punny title of Drag on Dungeons, since you drag on the tiles to make your dungeons. Yes, I know, it's very funny. But there's also a second hidden meeting that will become more apparent as I add more story elements, so I'm going to keep that one to myself for now. And the very last thing that I added was sound. So I composed some very, very simple tracks for the background music in the entire game. Basically, there's tunes for the shop, for when you're building your dungeon, and then I made themes for each of the biomes that there are, and you've actually been listening to them in the background of this video. So hopefully you're enjoying some of the tunes. I do quite like most of them. We'll see if they end up sticking. I might make them a little bit longer, since I think they're only about 8 seconds right now, that they kind of just like loop on that. So if I can make them longer, I can make them more in depth, but I have no experience composing music, so this is just kind of a first attempt at dipping my toe in the water. And the other thing I made were special effect noises, just things like that, like sound effect noises. And I implemented it in some areas that I thought could use it, like when you click on buttons, when you're attacking, when you're dying, and etc. So hopefully with all these changes, you can see that there have been some substantial upgrades to the game, and I'm very happy with the progress I was able to make in the past month. With all that being said, I've got a brand new build of my game that I'm happy with, so what do we do now? Well, I'm going to be holding another playtest. I'm hoping to get some more people and have them play through my game just a little bit. Probably not too many. I'm shooting for maybe around 10. So I'm going to start there, and I'm going to see what quality of life changes that they think could be made, some bugs that they might find, and some ideas for new content that they can think of, and see what comes from it. I've also recently just been introduced to a game that I have, has been very interesting to play through, and it's very similar in some ways to the kind of game that I'm making, and that game is Enter the Gungeon. So I have never played this game before, but after playing it very recently, stuff like the pixel art design and the mechanics it has, they're very similar to what I want to do in my game. So I might be looking at more in depth into this game and seeing what kinds of ideas I can get from it. Mostly on how the game is played in the back end. So like, how do they determine chest spawns or enemy spawns or room layouts, or enemy patterns, or things like that. Even maybe also some like UI elements, like how does their menu made and stuff like that. Mostly because it looks very good and it looks very clean, and I'd love to get some inspiration from it. Another game that I'm also paying very close attention to is Echoes of Wisdom. I'm a very big Zelda fan, so with there being a new Zelda game out, of course I had to play it, and I have been very pleased with the amount of enemy variety that's being used in the game. There's countless enemies from all across the series and a couple of new enemies as well. And because Zelda needs to interact with these enemies to help solve puzzles and stuff like that in the world, or just even attack other enemies. They've been really good at making some very unique designed enemies, and so I want to kind of look into and study some of these different like enemy attack patterns or and state types that each of these enemies have to help spark some ideas for my own enemies. And I already have 9 enemy types that I want in my game, but you know, fleshing out these enemies is a whole different story, so getting some inspiration from this game would definitely be a cool plus. And you know, I just think, I don't know who said this quote, but they said basically steal often, you know, steal well, and that's what I want to do by looking at both Enter the Gungeon and Echoes of Wisdom. So yeah, other than that, I think I will also be attempting to revisit some old code and make it a little bit more efficient. My code is starting to get a little spaghetti-like, and I really want to avoid this by making a more modular system. So I might be looking into adding some more classes or even composition within my game. I don't have any experience with composition, so I'm really gonna have to like study on like how it's working, how it's best implemented to see what I can do there. So with that being said, next month's progress might not be as substantial as this one, but by making my game more modular now, I'm hoping it will speed up the process for the later half of my development process, which is later down the line. Well, alright, that is all for this video, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. And also stay tuned, because I recently competed in a game jam in order to take a couple days off developing this game, and with the results coming out kind of recently, I did want to make a video on that and kind of go over some things that I learned, because I made a game in a different genre that I probably should have made like my first game in, but yeah. And also I'm just kind of hoping to upload a little bit more consistently on the channel than once a month, so that should be fun. So yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you all in the next one. Bye bye.